Hello, everyone. Welcome to SPF21. I'm Zena Harris, founder and president of GreenSpark Group. We're so glad you're joining us on day 3 of SPF. We started this event 6 years ago as part of our vision to change the climate of entertainment. It has been fantastic to see how it's grown and changed over the years. And we're especially excited about this year because it's virtual, and we hope more people from around the world will be able to join in and deepen their connections and knowledge of sustainable production. I want to thank Squamish Nation Elder Latash Maurice Nahani for the wonderful welcome. If you're unsure of whose traditional land you are watching us from, you can visit native-land.ca to find out. That link should come into the chat shortly. And please share with us in the chat where you are too. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of the Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other Indigenous people who made their homes along the Columbia River. We cannot do this work without our partners. So I'd like to thank our lead partners this year, our transformational partner, Real Green, Creative BC, and Motion Picture Production Industry Association, MPIA. Our presenting partner, MBS Equipment Company Canada. Signature partners, CBC Radio Canada and Telefilm Canada. Green Marketplace lead sponsor, The Green Shot. We are virtual. Please take an opportunity to engage in the event feed and post and take our polls. Say hello to partners and vendors, book one-on-one meetings, or grab a seat at a virtual table. This platform is for you. Please post any and all questions in the Q&A tab in the session on the right-hand side. And don't forget to pop into the platform tomorrow, Thursday. It's dedicated to the Green Marketplace and Community Hub, and you can interact with our ambassadors in virtual booths. If you're on Instagram and Twitter, join the social media conversation by following us at SPF_Vancouver and use the hashtag SPF21. You can also find us on LinkedIn and Facebook under GreenSpark Group. So we are pleased to offer many sessions this year with French translation. You can find that by clicking and accessible features. You can find the translation by clicking in on translation in the session and accessibility features by clicking on the blue logo in the bottom right corner. Remember to mute the mainstream if you're doing the French translation. And questions will be asked in English in the chat, but will be translated into French. From the session, you can get back to the main area of the platform by clicking our logo on the top left corner, or just leave the session and go back to the main place. There's tech support in our library under Help Desk if you have any questions or need any support there. Okay. One quote I left with on day 1 of SPF was from David Maggs. Hope is the new moral obligation. And I think that's a perfect way to lead into our first session of the day. We have a conversation about hopeful futures. The act of imagining different possible futures can be a radically positive thing. So let's learn more. I'd like to introduce Dr. Vanessa Timmer, who is moderating this session. Vanessa is the executive director of OneEarth, a Vancouver, Canada-based environmental think and do tank, creating and imagining sustainable ways of living in cities around the world. She is the co-lead for the KR-founded Beacon for Sustainable Living. Vanessa is also a senior research fellow at Utrecht University, leads a working group on the Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Committee for the United Nations 10YFP Sustainable Lifestyles and Education Program, and is a board member of the Canadian National Zero Waste Council. She holds degrees from Queen's University, Oxford, and the University of British Columbia, and was a Fulbright Scholar at Harvard. Vanessa writes, speaks, and teaches on sustainable living, social change, envisioning futures, and systems thinking. It's a pleasure to welcome you, Vanessa.
Thanks, Zena. Hello, everyone. I'm speaking here from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and we're grateful. It's called Vancouver now. We're very grateful for the stewardship that they've provided in the partnerships we have today. And as Sina is saying, today we're going to talk about hopeful futures. What kind of future do we want to live in? How do we get there? As human beings, we're really blessed with this capacity to think ahead, to explore, shape, and respond to futures. And it's particularly critical as we're faced with such an uncertain and complex future, where the exploration of different alternatives allows us to think outside the box of our current realities. And we really need to do that because in order to move towards a more sustainable future, we need to have a vision of what that could look like. As foresight specialist Nicole Ann Boyer says, the future is a realm that is not yet burdened by our current debates or our fixed positions, and we can become unstuck from some of the more doom and gloom aspects to get a sense of what's possible. And today's session is really about sustainable futures, like how we're going to live well, justly within the Earth's capacity, and the role of visual storytelling in taking a leap to reimagine our ways of living. And I'm joined by two fantastic panelists, Professor Manisha Anantharaman, who's a professor of justice, community, and leadership at St. Mary's College of California. She's an expert in community-based perspectives, exploring pathways and the politics of just sustainability transformations. She works with organizations around the world looking to transform consumption practices, including in cities, through educational programs, policy advocacy, and we work together on sustainable lifestyles globally. And Elan Mastai, who's a novelist, screenwriter, producer, including a writer of the novel All Are Wrong Todays. And he's currently a writer and producer, co-executive producer of the hit TV show This Is Us, for which he was nominated for an Emmy in 2021. He's the writer and producer of several films, feature films, including the award-winning The F Word, which you might know as What If, that stars Daniel Radcliffe, Zoe Kazan, Adam Driver, and Mackenzie Davis. So we're very pleased to have both of these panelists with us. Some of you might have joined Monday for the It's All in the Narrative session, and Dorothy Fortenberry at that session, who works with the Handmaid's Tale, she talked about how any contemporary movie or TV show that does not include climate change is a work of science fiction. So Manisha, I want to start with you, and let's start with the story content. So for imagining futures, what do we want to depict in terms of future daily lives, and how different might they be from how we live today? You are a commissioner on the Cambridge Commission on Scaling Behavior Change, supported by the Danish KR Foundation, that explored future lifestyles. It'd be great if you could tell us what you found with the commission, and maybe start off with telling about your personal experience growing up in a media world. Over to you, Manisha.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. And hi, everyone. I'm speaking to you from the unceded territories of the Ramaytush and Chochenyo Ohlone peoples, today known as Oakland, California. So I want to locate myself in these comments and tell you a little bit about kind of the hopeful futures that I saw growing up. So I grew up in India. And growing up in India, I consumed a lot of television made in the United States and perhaps in Canada. And particularly the TV show Friends was a big part of my childhood and my early teenage years. So growing up in India, I went to a school that was gender segregated. So girls and boys were not allowed to sit together, talk to each other, and this was very firmly enforced. So growing up watching the TV show Friends was kind of my hopeful future, my imagination of what my life could be like if I moved to the United States and have friends of who were boys, and I could live in a loft in New York and go to coffee shops and while away lots of time. And it was a source of aspiration. It gave me a sense of what my life could look like, which felt very different from what my life was like at that point growing up in India, as well as the lives of the adults who surrounded me, who didn't seem to have all this free time to hang out in coffee shops and somehow live in New York while being a waitress and a chef. But, reality is interesting. So kind of placing myself again in growing up in, what sometimes we call the global South or the developing world, We're often told to look towards places like the US and Canada as the model to aspire to, as the lifestyle to try and gain. But climate change has challenged that. Climate change has challenged that mirage as, is that even possible for the billions of people who are still stuck in poverty, who have not achieved the basic standards of living required for human dignity? What should we aspire for? What are we looking towards as the good life? And one of the biggest issues, I think, is that today the stories we're telling about our futures are increasingly becoming bleak. And I think this came out in the It's All in the Narrative panel, where one of the panelists pointed out how when we talk about the future, it's so much easier to go in the direction of dystopian science fiction and present the future as this place of kind of struggle and cruelty and wasteland. And so, young people in the global south, people everywhere are receiving these messages of a future that is increasingly bleak and hopeless. And when they ask the question, well, what can I do about it? They're provided with answers like switch your light bulbs, carry a reusable bag, solutions that are completely not coherent or at the scale that we need, the scale of transformation. And this produces a kind of cognitive dissonance. You're telling me that the world is falling apart, and the way I do something about that is by shifting what shopping bag I take to the store? Sounds just a little bit ridiculous. So I think this is our challenge, which is how do we tell stories? And this is a challenge for scientists and policymakers and educators and storytellers. How do we tell stories of alternative futures and tell stories about how we get there? So I want to now shift a little bit and pull up some slides to talk a little bit about, well, what is the scale of change that is required to achieve the kind of the world that a livable world in a changing climate, a world where more and more people have access to dignity and sustainable well-being in a changing climate. And I'm drawing here from the emissions gap report that was published by the UN Environment Program. And so what basically the emissions gap report tells us is that while we know that climate change is already changing the way in which we live our everyday lives and is going to change the way in which we live our everyday lives going into the future, we've already seen this. For example, I live in California. We have smoke days where we cannot go outside, fires and floods. What we don't talk about as much is that in order to prevent more catastrophic climate change, we might need to change how we live our everyday lives. That in order to mitigate climate change, we need to change how we eat, how we live, how we move about. So in the emissions gap report, there are several kind of key fundamental insights that have been put forward. The first is that 70% of, or about 2/3 of our emissions that we are putting out into the atmosphere are connected to how we live our everyday lives, can be attributed to the ways in which we move about, our mobility, what we eat, as well as how we heat and cool our homes. And therefore, shifts to how we do these things are critical to mitigating climate change. And if we look at, what sorts of kind of changes are required, there's a tendency to focus a lot on the technological solutions to the problem of climate change. That solar panels, more efficient appliances, but embedded in and connected to these technological changes are also changes to how we live our everyday lives, in terms of shifting our diets or actually adopting and bringing in these technologies into our homes. And the emissions gap report basically talks about kind of 3 types of changes, which is one, we might need to shift the ways in which we do things. We might need to give up or forego long distance flights, for example, and then also upgrade the ways in which we use energy through technology improvements. So I think this frame of thinking about foregoing, shifting, and upgrading is really useful when conceptualizing what types of shifts are required in our everyday lives in order to achieve these climate targets. But also really important to kind of note in all of this is that we also need to think about the fact that we're not, well, even though I'm saying we, there is a lot of global disparity in who is consuming these resources, who is producing these greenhouse gas emissions that are resulting in climate change. So as I pointed out early on in my comments, global resource use patterns are highly, highly unequal. So Zina, you said hope is a moral obligation. And I tell my students this all the time. If you're living in a world right now where you can turn on your lights, turn on your switch and you can get lights, you can open your tap and you have running water, you have a moral obligation to hope. Because there are so many people in the world who will pay the costs of a changing climate and never got to go to the party and never got to enjoy the things and take benefit of the things that this type of resource-intensive economic development has brought. And this inequity is really brought home for me in this next figure that I want to show you here. And actually, Vanessa, can I have you shift to the next one? And this is a study from Oxfam, which just points to the stunning inequality in emission patterns across income classes. That a small subsection of the global population, the top 10%, is responsible for a significant majority of greenhouse gas emissions that end up in the atmosphere, while those who currently suffer from material precarity, from deprivation, who do not have access to the basic material resources required to live a dignified human life, are going to bear the greatest costs. So this is also an issue of justice and about what we owe each other. So we need storytelling about this because we need to communicate to people where they are located. Who are you in this global pattern of resource distribution? And based on who you are, what can you do about it? And for those of us who work with communities who are not yet a part of this global consuming class, but are told that that's what the good life looks like, it's also about telling alternative stories about what does it mean to have a good life? What does it mean to be happy? What does it mean to find meaning and fulfillment in the ways in which you live your life? And I think this is where, as scientists and as sustainability scholars, we have failed. We haven't managed to tell very good stories about this. And I think this is where there is so much kind of beauty and hope that I see in media. And again, as somebody who watches a terrifying quantity of television, I'm really looking forward to seeing what this community can bring to this conversation and help us move this forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Manisha, for setting that context. And I want to pass it now over to Elan. When we heard from the It's All Narrative group, they were talking about how important it is to tell this story of transformative change in a way that's, entertaining and artful, that kind of gets at the texture of daily life, that brings us into the kind of humanness, the human story, the human dimensions. And that's what screenwriters can do so well, is to kind of bring us into the story at the scale of transformation. I mean, it sounds like what Manisha is alluding to is that the post-fossil world is going to be very different from the world that we've had to date. And you played with this a bit in the All Are Wrong Todays, the book that you wrote, where the main character that people imagined in the 1950s, this techno-utopian paradise of flying cars, moving sidewalks, moon bases, avocados that never go bad, punk music is not there because no one needs it. But then he time travels to today and finds out that for him, this is like a dystopian wasteland, but has these unexpected benefits in terms of his human experience. So can you tell us a bit about why you took on that future's journey? And also, what's the value of storytelling and imagining these possible futures Do you have any advice to give around how we can take on this challenge of telling the story that Manisha was illuminating?
Thanks, Vanessa, for those questions. And I'm in Los Angeles, as it's now known, but is the traditional territory of the Kizh, also sometimes called Tongva. Yeah, when I wrote All Around Today's, I mean, it came from a lifelong fascination with the future we were supposed to have. I grew up, my grandfather, who was a chemist, was a big science fiction fan, and he had a collection of old anthologies of science fiction from the 1950s and 1960s. And I loved spending time at my grandparents' house looking, reading through these old stories. In particular, I was fascinated by the covers, these garish painted covers of futuristic landscapes and flying cars and robot maids and, mad scientists. But even as a child in the 80s, I could tell that the vision of the future that these writers and artists were depicting wasn't turning out the way they thought it was. And here we are in 2021, and that's only, that sense of disjuncture is only accelerated. I'll make a little correction. In my novel, it's set originally in the 2020, it's set in 2017 when the book came out. But it's the 2017 that people in the 1950s and the post-war generation thought we were going to have. A world where technology has solved all of humanity's problems, supposedly. My protagonist ends up using a prototype time machine, because in this version of the world, time travel is possible. He doesn't travel to the past. He travels to the past, but it's our communal past. It's 1965, where he causes something to go wrong. And when he returns in a panic, he finds himself stranded in our version of the present day. Something went wrong in the mid-60s that changed the trajectory of human civilization. And now he ends up in, as you described, what to him feels like a dystopian wasteland, but to us is just literally the real world. I chose, I did a lot of research to think about when I wanted him to go back to, and I chose 1965 because it did feel to me like an inflection point in our imagination of the future. When, for a variety of reasons, cultural, social, political, economic, technological, our ideas of what the future might look like began to shift from the sort of more, the sort of glorious techno-utopia to an increasing awareness or worry that we were looking at a much more dystopian vision of the future. And part of that was the rise of the environmental movement and the understanding that the changes that we'd brought on the world since the Industrial Revolution, although if you want to get really, if you want to go really back, it's really the agricultural revolution. But, let's keep it just within a couple hundred years. That the changes that we'd wrought on the world because of the Industrial Revolution were not without consequence. A big idea the book talks about is the idea of the accident, which is inspired by the work of Paul Virilio, the French philosopher and cultural theorist. The idea of the accident is that every time you introduce a new technology, you also introduce the accident of that technology. When you introduce the car, you also introduce the car crash. When you introduce the plane, you introduce the plane crash. When you introduce the nuclear power plant, you introduce the nuclear meltdown. And what the book talks about is that when we introduce new technologies into the world, we have a responsibility to think through the implications, not just the good that it can do, our aspirations for it, but also the consequences, the potential accidents, all the things that could go wrong. And that there's a moral responsibility to take those things into consideration. So those are some of the ideas that the book explores. But it also kind of takes on this idea of like, is our vision of the future, are we still imagining, despite the rise of dystopian visions and our understanding of climate change and the other ways that our technological changes are affecting the world on a grand scale, are we still imagining the same technological future that they had in the 50s and 60s? Really, have we actually come up with new futures? And one of the things that I've been finding fascinating about some of the conversations that have been happening as part of the forum is genuine attempts to try to imagine and through storytelling articulate a new vision for the future that isn't just based on this idea that technology got us into this mess, and so technology is going to be what gets us out of this mess. That maybe there's another way of thinking about the future. Manisha's comments got me thinking about a quote by another science fiction novelist, William Gibson, who said, "The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed." And I think about that a lot when I'm writing about science, when I'm writing about futures, like whose future? And where is this future located? Who has access to this future and who's held outside of this future? I mean, I think there's three ways, general ways, that I feel like storytelling can help participate in the kind of conversations we're having. One is very short term, one is long term, and I guess one is more philosophical. In the short term, I think that there is an opportunity in storytelling to just normalize sustainable behavior, show it as a normal, everyday, quotidian backdrop to our characters' lives, as much a part of your day as brushing your teeth and taking the dog for a walk, And it has an added benefit of hopefully being true for many of us, we hope. But, part of this normalizing is dealing with is this kind of like internal conflict or potential hypocrisy, which is like, we want to make sure that sustainable daily behavior isn't just the purview of the wealthy or the privileged in the stories we're telling. I mean, look, this is a systemic problem in a lot of Hollywood storytelling. When you have wealthy and privileged people who create projects, greenlight projects, perform in projects, have the power to get these stories made, they're often wealthy and privileged, and so they're telling stories they relate to. And this is a crisis point throughout our society. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that this far into the economic impact of the pandemic, like the two most popular shows in the world are Squid Game and Made, which are basically about characters dealing with profound economic instability. I mean, in very different ways, to be clear. And probably the third most popular is Succession, which is basically about like, what pathetic monsters the obscenely wealthy are. But, as Manisha pointed out, there are hypocrisies and conflicts here, the inequities, and how the wealthy contribute to climate change versus who in our society bears the greatest impact of those changes. I mean, that's an internal conflict that storytellers have to grapple with. We know these giant corporations are responsible for an outsized amount of climate change, but these giant corporations, sometimes different ones, sometimes the same ones, are also how much of us access, like it's how we access our storytelling and our entertainment. And they're the ones funding it and distributing it. And so we as storytellers do have to grapple with those conflicts. So that's the first thing, I think, in terms of the short term. I think the second thing is long-term storytelling. And it's more what we're talking about, which is articulating a vision for the future, what our world could be, what our lives could be. And this is, of course, where we do tumble into the realm of science fiction. And we've seen many decades now of dystopian visions of the future. And it's not hard to understand why this feels likely to so many people. I think the problem with dystopia is easy, I mean, not living in it, obviously that's very hard, unless you are really good with a bow and arrow. But I think, these convincing dystopias, they say to us, there's nothing you can do. You don't have to take responsibility because this is inevitable. It's too big for one person to stop. So don't even try, just accept this depressing truth that it's all going to get worse and it's never going to get better again. Right. That's what a lot of these dystopias tell us on like a philosophical level. So, I mean, the alternative, is these utopian visions of the future that we want to be hopeful and we want to be comforting. But we also have a sort of the mirror of that risk, which is that the hope could be hollow and the comfort could be narcotic. Like a utopia can also be another way of saying, don't worry about it. Someone else is going to take care of it. It's all going to be okay. We fetishize these billionaire technologists who are going to come up with this amazing technology that's going to solve all our problems for us. And you don't have to really do anything. They're going to solve the problems. All you have to do is wait and hope. And I think that that can be infantilizing, and I think that we don't need stories that treat us like infants. I think we need stories that treat us like adults, stories that say, yes, we've got real problems and they're not going to go away unless we, that is like you and I, all of us, do something about it. And again, I'm not saying like we shouldn't be writing hopeful futures. We absolutely should be. And film and TV, audiovisual storytelling, especially the budget levels that you can have in Hollywood productions, are uniquely poised to depict hopeful possibilities in compelling ways. And I think that we can create these North Stars that help people find, passage through the storms that are coming. There was a quote from, about hope as a moral obligation, but I think the most effective hope comes with a plan. So that's how I think about it in terms of the short term and the long term. The third thing I just want to say is, how do we find our way there, from where we are now to where we want to be? And I think it's a bit more of a philosophical approach, and it gets to the heart of storytelling and what storytelling does best. And this isn't even specifically about sustainability, although it can and should be. It's about personal responsibility. And the good news is stories can be often kind of bad at making political arguments. They can make them kind of, there's a tendency to kind of like water them down or make them seem too simplistic, both in terms of the negative and the positive. But stories are really, really good at depicting characters making choices and taking responsibility for the consequences of those choices. I would argue that ultimately that's all storytelling is. A character faces an obstacle and makes a choice to overcome it. And either that choice succeeds or it fails. And if it succeeds, the story's over. So for most of the story, it's actually going to fail, right? And the character is going to have to face the consequences of that failure and make new choices, better choices, wiser choices. And those choices are also going to fail because the obstacle is so challenging. In fact, the obstacle is existential, this obstacle that they're facing. And the status quo the character has been drifting along in is no longer sustainable because this obstacle is going to blow that status quo away. And to solve it, the character that we're following in our story has to change into someone that makes better and wiser and bolder choices. Ultimately, that's the only way they're going to succeed. That's the model of storytelling that goes back to Aristotle. And it sounds a little familiar because it's what we all face in our lives right now when it comes to climate change. Characters facing these giant existential obstacles and making necessary choices. That's what storytelling is about. And so I think that what we can do as storytellers is tell stories that empower our audience to see the importance of making these choices in our own lives and facing up the consequences of our decisions and taking responsibility for the future that they want to live in, to hope, but to hope with a plan.
Great. Thanks, Elan. And we're already getting a comment also that in terms of who should be taking that responsibility, also really shaping stories for those who are in the 10%, the 1%, to really get a sense of what responsibility they hold in that way. And so I've been given the AOK to go an additional 5 minutes beyond the 1:45. So I'm going to take that time. We're not seeing questions yet in the platform, which allows me to do something different, which is to show you a few slides, Elan and Manisha, from the work that OneEarth has been doing globally on imagining futures. So we'll bring up these slides because what we're finding is exactly what you're describing, Elan, that when you looked at the science fiction novels on the bookshelf, a lot of times the images of the future were a little bit more like this, right? This kind of high-tech future. And often the images were, and also, of course, many promoted also by companies in terms of this high-tech future, often floating above the city, about 15,000 feet. So you'd look down upon the city. So just wanted to know that that's typically what people, when they picture a future, and when you Google future, you get a lot of this. When you Google green future, interestingly, people start throwing, I just want to note that this is really interesting. In Accra, Ghana, this, the Acrotopia was a set of images that were put in some of the communities within Accra. And you can see how they're taking a particular street in Accra and then layering over that flying cars, high-rise tower kind of image. So that kind of idea of projecting that onto these communities as being the ideal, and you see the people kind of hovering around it, looking at what their possible future could be, very one-sided. So I just wanted to show that. But also to say, when we talk about green futures, often it's like plastering green all over everything. This is a depiction of New York in the future, and you do see public transport, people gardening, but notice how common these images are. No matter where you go, particularly in the Western world, when people picture sustainable futures, it's often that kind of green buildings, greenery, and it starts showing up also, for example, in this image of a future Nairobi. So just kind of adding a lot of green. And what we're trying to look at with our projects around sustainable futures is what might be, who's actually determining what kind of futures are being depicted, as you're mentioning, Elan, who's deciding what future images we're seeing. And we're starting to see some shifts with Chinese science fiction, with Afrofuturism. We're starting to see like much more prominent voices coming from other places. And this project that was about imagining different cities around the world was a much more diverse exploration of what their communities could look like. And and of course, the whole solar punk movement is also starting to really reimagine the future from a different perspective. And a colleague of ours also depicted an imagined future South Africa, which still embeds some of the hair salons, the local businesses, and in terms of imagining people walking around that are, from that community, but also incorporating biodiversity right into the heart of the city. By the way, that zebra crossing you see there actually was picked up and is now painted in South Africa in some of the zebra crossings. So, what's seen as depicted can become reality. And I'll just want to say that I'll just show you a few other slides from the Envisioning Sustainable Lifestyles project we did with people from around the planet, where we really looked at what is missing from those future stories. Like, for example, depicting how religion passes values on to different communities. These are made up images that we created as part of this project. We also imagined people being part-time workers in an office and part-time producers. We imagined that possibly the end of life and how we're born could be reimagined in sustainable futures, or even the future of education. So I would just recommend we take a look at the Beacon for Sustainable Lifestyles work on imagining futures that might be interesting to take for people on the joining us to follow our work on futures. And I'll just go back to the panel now. Manisha, Elan, we have one question from the audience as well, but do you have any reflections to seeing that? Let's start with you, Manisha.
Yeah, thank you, Vanessa. And, looking at that, and I saw these images growing up about what my city should be like. And, compared to the city I lived in, which was super walkable, had little kind of markets in every street corner. And for me, those images are hegemonic. And I like to think about, well, whose power is being reinforced by an image of a tech futuristic city? Is like Elon Musk going to be a trillionaire in this future? And on the converse, who doesn't have power? Whose agency is reduced in this future? And I think one of the biggest kind of things that storytelling can do to move us beyond these kind of flat images is, and like Elan said, how are people dealing with each other in these new futures? And how are those kind of relationships, which are always involved kind of dealings with power, right? People trying to influence each other. How are those different from the realities we're currently occupying, where we not only live in an unequal world in terms of resources, but also a very unequal world in terms of power? Who is making our spaces? Who is controlling these stories that, we're telling about what futures can look like? So I think one of the challenges is also to think about synthesis, which is living sustainably is not just about going back to some, utopic past, which also doesn't really exist, but it's about thinking about the dimensions of existing lifestyles, the ways in which people live as connected to their cultures and their histories, and thinking about that in relation to a future that will have some role for technology, that will have a changed or a changing climate, and thinking about how to bring those together and to tell a synthesis that is, not a simplistic yearning for a mythicized past, and not, also looking forward to some tech future where essentially we're further giving up our power by looking to kind of tech saviorism to fix our problems.
Yeah, thanks, Manisha. Elan.
I think that really gets to the heart of it, that grasping for synthesis. I think that the history of science fiction has been like largely techno-fetishist. And, it feels like in our society, there's a lot of people who read science fiction and just think, oh, wow, that's cool, we should do that. And rather than acknowledging that often these are warnings about the future. Often these of the authors, this is not being presented in an ideal way. They're often trying to look ahead from where we are right now and warn us about some of the pitfalls of introducing these technologies into the world. Unfortunately, they don't tend to teach irony in engineering school. You know, I think a lot about when I'm writing about this stuff. It is trying to figure out what's working for us in our world and what isn't. You know, I mean, we're still in the middle of a true global experience of the pandemic. And a lot of people through this pandemic have had an opportunity to look at their lives and figure out what's working, what isn't. The pandemic has been a gigantic thumb on the scale of inequity and instability all through our society. And while nobody would have wished this, it has also been an amazing spotlight for us to really think about what's working. And we're seeing now, a year and a half, 2 years into this, a lot of areas in society where people are not willing to go back to the way things were.
Right.
And I think that becomes, for us as storytellers, a powerful tool, because we just have to look at reality to know how people might actually react to this kind of global phenomenon and that we're staring down the barrel of.
Great. Thanks, Elan. So for the last kind of 30 seconds each, the question really was about mainstreaming these lives, these lifestyle depictions. If there is maybe one thing, and we'll start with you, Manisha, that you would say to keep in mind as we mainstream this, like how we would get this out, what would you say just in 30 seconds? Oh, you got to unmute. There we go.
Paying attention to difference and make sure that in our attempts to mainstream this, we're not kind of glossing over inequities, cultural differences, issues of race and class, and making sure we're weaving those into our storytelling as we mainstream.
Great, thanks. And Elan?
I mean, I would echo exactly what Manisha just said. And I would add that you still also have to tell a great story. When you're very passionate about something and you feel it very, very strongly, but storytelling is not necessarily the best place for polemic. What it is an opportunity to show people making difficult choices and going through changes in their lives. And I think that if you can find ways in your story to take your passions and your world building and your visions for the future, but rooted in stories about people making decisions and taking action and making changes in their personal lives, I think you're going to find a story that's all the more compelling and draws the audience towards you instead of pushing them away.
Thank you so much, Manisha and Elan. Let's make the act of imagining different possible futures radically positive and entertaining. It's great to have been on this panel with you. Back to you, Zena.
Awesome. Thank you so very, very much for this and for your insightful views and really powerful perspectives. If we question, reimagine, shift, and hope, I feel like we're going to get there, and really appreciate your insight. Thank you all. All right, now it's time to leave this room and move over to our next session. We'll see you all very soon. Thank you.